Moving on from crop budgets to crop markets now, and Jeff Peterson of Heartland Farm Partners is our guest this week. And from trade news with China to a new Argentinian export tax to preparing for next year, there's a lot to talk about. And we began by getting Jeff's wrap-up of the 2019 season.
You know, this is always a great time of the year to go ahead and think back. And if you really look back, it's hard to believe we started off the year about $3.98 on December corn. But what was really kind of hard to believe, Troy, is we went down. We got all the way down to the middle of really, by the middle of May, down to about $3.63 a bushel. And then all of a sudden, it's the year of prevent plant, right? The market took off and went up all the way up to $4.73 by the middle of June. And if we sit back and think about that, I think that's a very valuable thing for us to study. What did it take for us to see that market move that much? It took us to go from about 1.5 million acres of prevent plant the year before to almost 19 million acres of prevent plant. And the market's anticipation of that. And then, of course, as the year came along, that meant that we had a really late harvest and a lot of uncertainty about yield, and there's still uncertainty about yield. But now we're finally getting a bounce, because all during that time, what were we fighting with? We were fighting with the concern and the talk of the Chinese trade talks. And so now we're finally at a point some pieces are coming together and we're starting to get a little bit of a bounce. So here we are.
Yeah, and we'll get into Chinese trade talks in just a second. So you're a professor here on campus. What letter grade would you give for harvest this year for corn and soybeans?
Oh boy, I think you'd have to go ahead and I'd say it depends on where you're at, just like the students are. But overall, I'd have to give it a D- and on the way to an F.
All right, that's no good. Maybe next year will be better, right? Okay, so we mentioned China, so trade with China, it's in the news. So tell us why things are going to be different this time around. What are the updates? By this point, should we even care? Because it's like we talk about it all the time. What's different this time around?
Yeah, I think the difference is before we've got up to maybe just a step or two before this point, we actually got to a point where we had an agreement basically on the text of the deal. And we actually had announcements by both governments, the Chinese government and also the U.S. government. And now they're in the process of doing their legal review and doing their language scrubbing, which becomes that common part. So I think the market is looking at it differently. It says we're on the way to getting a trade agreement. But now, what it's going to take is, if we want to continue to keep this market moving higher, we actually have to see some of the fruit come from this agreement. And that fruit has to come in the way of actually seeing more purchases come from China.
Has there been any reaction to the soybean market with this news? Because whenever you hear about trade with China, soybean is always the first crop that comes to mind. So any reaction in that market?
There really has been. If we look back to when the talk of this, so last week on Thursday after the market closed, kind of the trade started talking about it. Now, based on the move we had during that day, I think there was a few that might have had a hint of it, because we had some stronger market action during the day. But then once the trade talks came out, then since then, we've had beans up probably around 30, a little over 30 cents a bushel, so it's been beneficial. But amazingly, Troy, at the same time, we've actually had corn up about 25 cents a bushel. And if you'd look back to even including the day, that Thursday before that report came out, from that time we'd be up about 35 cents. So it's helped. But I think the thing that's actually dampening the price move on the beans a little bit still has to come back to that African swine fever and overall the reduction in demand that's coming out of China because of that.
All right, let's move on elsewhere internationally, Jeff. And you tweeted an article about Argentina's new export tax. So what are the impacts that this could have on the corn market in particular?
Well, there's a couple pieces to that, I think. I think what we were seeing is that before, and this is nothing new, there's been a lot of talk about this happening because the Argentine government needs to find additional ways to go ahead and try to get the funding for their government. And so I think what we had is Argentina offering out a lot of bushels ahead of this, because they thought, hey, let's get these bushels moved. So over the course of the last couple months, they've been very aggressive on their sales, which means they've been priced cheaper than us. What happened though now is that actually we're at about an equal price with them. And some would say on the new offers that are coming forward, we're cheaper on them. So it's going to give us an increase on the demand side. The thing we're watching is, when do they have bushels available again? We're starting to see some competitive offers come from them getting out into the latter part of March timeframe. But time will tell how harvest goes and growing season goes for them.
A couple questions to set the stage for next year. So from the producers that you've talked to, what's on their top of their mind as we get into 2020?
Well, I think a lot of the question comes back to they've been hopeful that a trade deal would get done. They really believe a couple things. They believe that acres are going to have to come down as we go forward, but unfortunately, Troy, I don't think they will. They think yields are going to have to come down a little bit more. I think they'll come down a little bit in the January report, maybe a couple bushels on the corn side, maybe a half a bushel on the bean side. But the big thing that everybody's wrestling with is how many acres of corn, how many acres of beans do I go ahead and plant? So I think what we have to be looking at from the marketing side is we have to look at what are some reasonable price expectations. We're getting a nice move in this market right now. I think this is a market move that we're going to have to sell some old crop corn. We're also going to have to be focused on selling some new crop corn. The other statement I would say, Troy, is that I think this is a type of year where we're going to have to be ready to sell more corn and maybe more beans earlier than what we normally are. Because the big thing in everybody's mind is how many acres of corn could we plant? And I just want to give you one parting kind of thought on as we look at the balance sheets. Right now, as we look at our amount of ending stocks, about 1.9 billion bushels here is what we'll have left over when we get out to August 31st of 2020. As we put our projections together for the 20 crop, which will get planted this spring, some of our numbers would suggest, based on the acres and the yields, that we could be over 3 billion bushels. And if that's the case, then you got to start thinking as we get out to harvest, you'd have to start thinking about corn sub $3. Now, it won't go there right away, and there'll be opportunities to sell, but we kind of got to place that in the back of our mind.
And any other preparations that we can be doing right now to prep for 2020, or any deadlines that we need to be thinking about, or anything we need to tie up with insurance right now before the end of the year?
Now, those are good points. Depending on your stage, there's still some individuals are going to be struggling from the insurance side up as we move further to our friends up north as they try to wrap up harvest. But the biggest things is make sure they've got their year end intact. If they need to go ahead and generate some cash, but they don't necessarily want to set the price, they could move some grain on some basis contracts. And if they also need to either come up with some additional income this year or some additional cash flow, but they don't want the income, don't forget about that FSA loan program that they can use to go ahead and come up with additional money without selling.
And finally, any idea on what commodity you think may have the greatest upside potential as we get into 2020?
Well, I know this really seems hard to believe, but honestly, as we look forward, I still think actually over which one's probably got the most potential. I think you got to look over to the soybean side, and then as you move beyond actually the corn and bean side, I think I'd be optimistic on what the pork prices can do if we can go ahead and get these tariffs worked out with China, because China's got a tremendous demand that they're going to end up having from anything that deals with the protein side.